Hello, this is Nick Pellegrino from asileFX, and welcome to Getting Started with View 8. This training is both for Infinite and xStream, and although I'm primarily showing everything within the standalone version, which is Infinite or xStream standalone, everything you see will be available in both applications, and if you're using xStream, the commands I'm using will also be available directly within your host application. So to get started, what I want to do is show you how to create a simple scene within View. And we're just going to cover some of the more basic elements of the program and just create a fairly simplistic scene. Now, the scene I have loaded in, right now what we can see is just the default scene. If you go up to File and New, we can see we have the selection to choose an atmosphere. Now, whenever you create a new scene, it will give you the choice to load in any of the atmospheres. Now, what I have selected is under Physical, and this is the default sky. There are a lot of different available atmospheres. You also find the default under Daytime, listed under Artistic and Spectral Sunshine. And this is a spectral sky, and we'll get into the different types of clouds and the different types of atmospheres available in a little bit. On the left side of the screen, we have our creation elements, the ability to add terrains, plants, water, also lights, ventilators, things like that. There's also some other commands and tools available. At the top, you've got some main icons, which would be the new, open, save. Everything is also available up at the top through the menu bars. There are also some edit commands up at the top, the ability to load in atmospheres and access the atmosphere editor. Once again, all of this is available up at the top. So what I want to start with is switching the viewports. Now, depending on the current configuration you have at the default, there are different viewport modes, and this is the 4 viewport, and I access this just by double-clicking on the title of the viewport. You can also go up to the top here, and where we have Toggle Current View, it'll go from the 4 viewport mode, which is an orthographic projection, with the main camera view, or you can switch this over to the perspective view, which is set up a little bit differently and not linked to any cameras. You can also switch and really set up the views how you want. A typical orthographic projection would have the main camera view in the upper right, and then what is normally the side view in that lower right area. So I'm going to switch this back to the default because View does tend to work a little bit better with some of the default layouts. Although the improvement to the OpenGL in recent versions really has fixed a lot of the old problems associated with changing the main camera view from the lower right viewport. So over on the left, what we can do is select to add in objects into our scene, and what we want to first add in is a terrain. Now, there's 2 different types of terrains. Technically, there are 3 types, but the third type is associated with one of the others. So what we have is a standard terrain, and we'll first just take a look at kind of the differences between these, and the other is a procedural terrain. Now, the difference is based on the quality and geometry amounts. Now, what I can do is rotate the camera within the scene. I'm just right-clicking to pan around the viewport. If you hold down Shift, you can move side to side. And then, depending on how you have your setup, you can use the scroll to zoom in and out. If you hold down Control, it will change the camera focal. And then we also have, in the main camera view over on the right, the ability to rotate around a selected object, which rotates around the object's pivot point. And we'll take a look at pivot points a little bit later. For the most part, by default, it'll be the center of the object. You can also move in and out, change the camera focal, which is the zoom, and then pan around. So panning would be the same as shift and right click, and then the scroll would modify moving in and out. Control and right click would be the same as changing the focal. And unfortunately, rotate around selected object is not hotkeyed. So you do have to use the main camera preview in order to rotate around a selected object. Unless you own Camera Orbiter, which is part of asileFX Snowflake. And that's a dynamic camera tool I created that creates an orbital camera. And you'll end up seeing that a little later in the training. Okay, so the difference between these two types of terrains, the procedural and a standard terrain, is right now they pretty much look the same within the interface. I also want to note that under Display up at the top, I do have Show Selection Wireframe turned off. When you have this option turned on, it makes it very difficult to see anything. If you do need to see the wireframe, keep it on. Turning off the on top option will allow you to see behind. But for the most part, I like to just keep it off. I do have my wireframe color set to blue, or my selection color. If you go up to File and Options, and under the Display options, you can change the color of whatever the selection you have will show up when the object is selected. So right now mine's set to more of a greenish blue. If you go to the General Preferences, go to Interface Colors, we can also see the selection wireframe and wireframe highlight located in there. I do believe that saving these options, which you can see, we can load, save, and set a new interface color configuration. Saving these options may not save out your selection wireframe color. That could be tied to the main default scene and some of your general preferences. So if you save it out and that color doesn't carry over when you load it in, it may not be part of that. So I just wanted to mention that. So what I want to do is a quick render of just these two terrains. And what we can do is render in this view. So rendering what we're seeing right now. And up at the top, we have a quick render. So if we click on the little camera icon, it will do, by default, a preview render. And anytime you render, by default, the post-render options will show up, giving you the option to turn on auto exposure, use the natural film response, and set up different post-process options. If you can see, we have show this dialog when render completes. I'm going to check it off, click OK, and now this will no longer come up after every single render. Now, the quality of this is really quite low. Very pixelated, doesn't look great. It's because there's virtually no anti-aliasing. So if we right-click on this camera, we can change the quick preview render options. I'm going to set it to final render, and now if I render, it's going to create a much better looking render. And we can start to see the quality differences between these two terrains. A standard terrain is a fixed geometry quality. It's based on a control of a pixel amount. And from that pixel amount, a polygon is generated. A procedural terrain is an infinite amount of detail, meaning no matter how close you get to the object, it's always going to have a really, really high amount of geometry and detail. It dynamically updates as the camera moves closer. So first let's take a look at the standard terrain a little closer, you can see it's very pixelated, very polygonal looking, and the quality isn't great. There's even a little bit of tearing on the bottom, so much lower quality. If we take a look at the standard terrain, or sorry, the procedural terrain, and now render and take a look at this, we're going to see a huge improvement in quality. This is based on a fractal and different noises created within the function editor. You can also load in these functions, and we'll take a look at that a little bit later. Now, that quality of the standard terrain isn't always going to be as bad looking as it does right now, because when you load in a material, it will kind of overwrite everything and make it look better. Procedural terrain doesn't always require as high of bump settings on a material or as interesting of a material in order to get a good amount of detail. What you'll also notice is if you look in the lower right part of the screen, there is a polygon count amount. Depending on what settings you have, there is a little arrow that you can click on and set it to your available free resources on your system or the polygon count of the scene. Now, as it is rendering, it is calculating the polygon count and updating. So we'll see the polygon count increase as the scene renders. That also works and happens with dynamic population for ecosystems. So we're moving up to 8 million polygons in the scene, and it's increasing. Once the render stops, that polygon amount will decrease and go down, because that information is no longer part of the scene, it's just generated at render time, or carried over to the next frame if you're doing animation. Now, if you need to pull up the last render, as you can see I clicked and that render is gone, up at the top there are a couple more options next to that camera. We can click on the 3 colors, and that pulls up the last color render. The next one over is the alpha, which right now, because everything in the scene was an object that was showing, it's all going to be white. And the next option is the Z depth. Now you can save this out. So you can take a look where the disk is, and you can save, and then select your file format. Choose options. If there are options for the available format, we'll do EXR options, and then we can choose the different format options for that specified image format. I also have, if we go to File and Options, bypass visual browser for scenes and pictures. So anytime I load in a scene, file open, or go to load an image, it's going to use, in this case, the Windows system, since I'm using Windows. So they'll use your operating system file chooser. I also want to note that the Z-depth display is 8-bit, and so will be the color and the alpha. When you save it out as a 32-bit, it'll look a lot better, but the previews that show within View are going to be 8-bit images. So if we just take another look at this standard terrain within the terrain editor, now we can access the terrain editor in a couple of different ways. One is to double-click on the terrain. We can see the editor opens, which we can resize. Just going to click OK right now. Another way to edit the object is if you go up to the top, right next to where the cloud are showing up, and you see a little question mark next to a box, that's also Edit Object. You can right-click in the scene, in the viewport, and select Edit Object if it's selected. The object does have to be selected, and then you can also double-click within the layer view over on the right. There's a couple of different ways to view the layers. You can sort by type. So now we can see our terrains in the scene, cameras. We can do by name, by the size. I'm going to organize in layers where we can also create new layers. And then we can drag objects into these other layers and even hide them from the scene with that little eye. You can also lock them so they cannot be edited. Oh, they're not supposed to be able to be edited. Okay, so once it's locked, we can't click on it as long as we don't select it within the layer. So once it's locked, anything in the scene that happens to be intersecting with the terrain, you don't need to worry about selecting the object. Now that standard terrain we can see is 256 by 256 pixels. For every pixel, a polygon is generated. Technically two, because it is triangulated. So we have the polygon divided in half. So 256 by 256 is our total polygon count for a standard terrain, and then multiplied by 2 because we're triangulating every single polygon. So it's 3-point polygons instead of 4-point polygons. The resolution for a standard terrain is defined at the top by this amount. We can multiply it by 2, so now we have 512 by 512. We could also use the resize terrain option, so we could type in an amount manually. This is better for jumping between lower amounts like 256 up to 2048, so you don't have to calculate the in-between values. It doesn't have to be square either. And I'm just going to resample, and now we have 1024 by 1024. It still looks a little pixelated because it's based on that original sampling. If we go over to the left, I'm going to click on Mountain, and that's going to generate and apply a new terrain on top of that. If I click Zero Edges, we'll raise it down, make it look a little more mountainous. Up the top, there's a few different options. One is the Show Specular. I'm going to go ahead and turn that off so we don't have that highlight. But now this pixel resolution does define the display quality of a procedural terrain. So if we edit the procedural terrain, at the render time, as you saw before, it was very high quality, but in the editor, it doesn't look very good. So if we need to, we can multiply the resolution, and you're going to see it look much better and not be based on that pixel amount as in the standard terrain. And that's because the samples are based on this procedural altitude. So because we're going to be covering these terrains with ecosystems, I'm not going to worry about using a procedural terrain because we don't need that detail. We're mostly going to be rendering an ecosystem. Now, I did set my focal length and change it earlier. So if we want to take a look at the actual focal length amount, we can select the main camera, and up at the top, this is called the Aspect tab. Now you can see that name popping up. And now we can preview the focal. Well, I'm going to set in a value of 35 millimeters. And there are a couple of different options that are important in the camera. One is the lock height above ground. What this is going to do is keep the camera above objects. So if I scale this terrain, it's going to knock the camera up with it. So that way the camera isn't going through the object. Another option is to keep the camera level. So I'm going to turn off the height lock and the keep level just for now. And that way we can bank the camera if we need to move it in some different orientations. The other two tabs are the numerics tab, modify the position, orientation, also scale, which isn't available for a camera, so we'll switch to the terrain, see scale. The twist amount, which is technically skew, it will skew the object, it will not twist it. And the pivot position. Moving over to the last tab is the animation tab, the motion tab. We'll take a look at that a little later. So what I want to do is select this terrain, and I'm going to scale it up, which I'm doing with gizmos. Now, if these gizmos are not showing because of your settings, what you can do is go to Display, Gizmo, Show Gizmo. I have pretty much all of these options on. Show gizmo helpers, resize handles, rotation handles, and allow moving outside the gizmo. If we take a look at these 4 buttons on the left that are coming down, and then the 3 on the right, what we have is a coordinate system on the left, parent. This is if you're grouping objects. The local coordinate system, a global, and then view, which is based on the camera that's looking at the object. We can also see a preview in the lower left of the axes in the scene. I'm going to set this to global. And on the right, we have position, rotation, and scale. Position, we can select the gizmo to constrain to Z, Y, or X. We could also just click on it, move it around. If we switch to the for viewport mode, we can select the object, move it, or constrain to the gizmo. Anytime you select an object outside of the gizmo, it will default to position. So I'm going to change this to scale, and we can scale it up. And if I want to raise up the height, I could just change the Z. And then if we take a look, if I click outside of the gizmo, it's automatically going to move it. So that's really helpful if you're in the for viewport mode. You want to move it, but you still want to keep that scale gizmo up. You can also hotkey these options so you can really quickly access them. File, options, operations, and the keyboard shortcuts, which there are a lot of operations that can be changed. So what you'd want to look for is the display and the gizmos, where we can see position, rotation, size, and then also the different coordinate systems. If you need to change the scale of a gizmo, make it larger or smaller, you can use the number pad, plus and minus keys. So holding it down will really just continue the operation, or you can just kind of hit it a couple of times, tapping it, make it go up and down. So that's a really easy way. You will find that if you are outside of the pivot point, you won't see the gizmo. Now, what I was just talking about before with always moving, if you're not selected on the gizmo, that is controlled under Display, Gizmos, Allow Moving Outside of Gizmo. So if I turn this off, we can now not change anything on the terrain unless we are using the gizmo. You can also turn the gizmos off. So there's a lot of different ways you can manipulate these objects. And I'm going to edit this terrain, open the terrain editor. Now, double-clicking on the terrain can sometimes be the quickest and easiest way to open the terrain editor, but sometimes it doesn't work. Yeah, that time it did. If you run into an instance or an occasion where you double-click and it won't open, normally what you can do is if you go just below the gizmo where the pivot point is and double-click, then it'll open. So I'm going to change the pixel resolution to 512 by 512. And there's a lot of different tools for customizing terrains where you can paint, pull out sections. We're going to take a look at that a little more in depth later. Right now we're just going to kind of look at some of the manual controls for generating terrains. And on the left, we can choose through some of the presets to generate the terrain. Now, what these do is apply to the existing terrain you have. So we'll take from the information that is already there. There's a little bit of crease you can see from using the peak mode. And if I change this to peak, we can now see part of that canyon showing up. So if you want to start fresh, you can go up to the top, click Reset. And I just turned off that specular effect. Now, if we take a look at some of the different views and the way to navigate in the terrain editor, up the top we can reset the view. There are also some options to change the terrain. There are symmetrical terrains which will mirror the terrain top and bottom, skin only, just the outside. We'll look at those a little later. But if we take a look at the top, we can view the top view. So it'll automatically switch to a top view of the terrain, but still leaves you within the ability to rotate around. Now if you want to reposition, you can hold down Shift, and if you see that little center pivot that's showing up, it gives you an idea of where the center of the camera is and where we're going to be rotating around when we right click and move. And up at the top there are also some other options. We can show the wireframe if we want to see what the polygons look like. We can now see those triangulated polys. And of course that specular effect. We also have some clipping planes. These have to do with the bottom and the ability to cut out areas of the terrain. So we can move a clipping plane down on the top or cut out parts of the bottom. So if we turn off Show Clipping Plane, it's now going to only show the active part of the terrain because I'm now cutting out the other sections. That can also be used with some of the painting controls. But just looking at the basic operations, and I'm using the scroll to zoom in and out. Over on the left, those options we have to generate terrains, they are directly controlled by the pixel resolution. So if we decrease the pixel resolution to 128 by 128, not only will we notice something generating much quicker, but the detail will be sized differently. And the fractal that it's using to generate and apply on top of the terrain is going to be sized differently, and of course much larger. So the mountain right now gives us a very good overall shape. If we go to a much higher amount, 1024 by 1024, I'm going to reset it, click mountain. Now we're going to see a lot of peaks and a lot of detail. So sometimes moving up and down through the pixel resolution, ultimately you want to end up with a higher resolution. But you can generate some very interesting looking terrains that way. And if we take a look at the Effects tab, that works the same way. We have a lot of erosion effects, and you can click and hold down the mouse using the left mouse button, clicking and holding on the buttons in order to continue that effect. Do not do that with the River Valley. It takes a long time to generate River Valley and the look. Go ahead and click on that, and it's going to create a very nice eroded terrain, something that looks really realistic. But there are a lot of different erosion effects, and if we take a look at the rock hardness, this controls the effect of erosion, how soft the creases are going to be, and the applied effects, or if they're going to be something a little bit sharper. So we can see a really nice eroded terrain using River Valley, but it does take a long time to generate that. And if you're using a resolution higher than 512 by 512, it can take a very long time to generate that. The rest of the effects go very quickly. You can see we use all of these different effects. There's thermal, and they all apply different looks to the way the terrain is eroded. And we could do some very hard effects, and decrease our resolution, and end up with something that looks a little bit different as we build our way up. So a really cool and neat technique for working with these effects is to start with a low resolution. And you can see River Valley goes very quickly when you're working with the lower resolution. But what you can do is slowly build up your effects. And just apply a couple of them, multiply the resolution, add a few more, multiply it again. And if you build your way up through the effects this way and through the pixel resolution, you can end up with some really nice looking terrains and some really realistic looking erosion effects. And anytime you want to kind of subtract the edges, you can use the zero edge mode, which will apply kind of a Gaussian around the edge and a fall off. And there are also some global effects. And using a combination of the erosion and the global effects will create some really neat terrain. So we could add stones, which will generate some nice bumps on the terrain. Using gravel, we'll give a nice fine noise. Grit, add stones again, maybe go back, add some of these erosion effects. So since this mountain is going to be a little closer to the camera, I'm going to increase the resolution once more. So we're at 1024 by 1024, add a few stones, apply a few erosion effects. And diffusive is an overall smoothing. So if you feel you need to really smooth out the terrain, you can use diffusive. So we'll go ahead and click OK. And what I also want to do is save the scene out at this point. Now you may have noticed that the scene did slightly change just before editing this terrain, and that's because I did crash the program. So it's always a good idea to save, and what I'm going to do is save as. Now I already have the file saved out, but I do want to show you two of these options, which is the Incorporate Texture Maps and Compress File option. Compressing the file will reduce file sizes, and can be pretty nice to have on. Incorporate Texture Maps will drastically increase the size of your scene if you're using a lot of texture maps or any sort of plant in the scene. It's going to include all of those textures directly in the scene file, and it's not always needed, because if the content is installed on the system, it can easily reference that content in those folders, and you don't need to have that option selected. When you have populated ecosystems in the scene, you're not using dynamic population, it is going to drastically increase everything, and the file sizes can become quite large. So it's usually a good idea to keep that option off until you get to the end of your scene. Once you have it finalized, then maybe save it out with incorporated texture maps. Makes it a little bit easier when you're using network rendering.